This is episode number 200 of the CSK8 podcast, and honestly, I didn't know how far this podcast would go when I first started creating episodes almost 4 years ago. Apparently, most podcasts only last about 3 episodes before the host realizes this is a ton of work and it's not worth it, and I don't have like a bajillion followers right now. But interestingly enough, I actually recorded and edited the first 18 episodes of the podcast in the first month, most of which was done on the weekends. And today we now have about 20,000 RSS subscribers, which I think is an inflated number, but that's the number that my website gives me, so that's the metrics that I'm going with, which is pretty cool. Quite frankly, I'm honored that people would be willing to listen and share these podcast episodes as well as the free content that I create on my website, as I'm trying to create this content to help people out, to learn how to become computer science educators, or in the Scratch content that I create, just to learn how to create Scratch. Now, because this is kind of like a special episode in terms of the 200th episode, I just wanted to share where the podcast has been the last few months, what I've been working on, to give you a little behind the scenes explanation of the things I've been attempting to experiment with, and where I'm planning on going in the future. So you probably noticed over the last several months, I have been intentionally not doing many interviews. I've only done a couple in the 2023 so far. And the reason why is because I wanted to focus specifically on refining these solo episodes to improve them. I noticed there was a lot of fluff at the beginning of the Unpacking Scholarship episodes where it might take a minute or two before I'd actually get into what we can learn from this scholarship. So hopefully you've noticed and appreciated those changes that I've been making. I also started adding in some professional development episodes where I kind of unpack pedagogy and practice that I actually use in the classroom. Like, how did I set up my computer lab? And how have I seen other people set up their computer labs? I've had the privilege of working with every single grade, kindergarten through doctoral student, and spoken with and visited many educators across the country. So I've seen a lot of different computer labs in different spaces and figured I'd share, here's what I've seen in different areas that I think work well and why. And these little professional development podcasts have kind of developed out of other educators just simply asking me questions, whether it's at like CSTA's conference or in the comments section like in last week's episode. So if you got some more questions for myself that you'd like to ask, just make sure you add it into a comment on a video like this one, then I can answer it in a future episode. Another thing that I started to do was to actually talk about some more current events, like how legislation is impacting CS education and problematizing corporate discourse. I know these can get a little bit more political than some educators might want, but I think it's important that we talk about it, which is why I started adding in some episodes on that. Outside of all the podcast episodes, I've also been releasing a new Scratch video every single day on my YouTube channel and website. If you just go to jaredoleary.com/Scratch, you can find over 50 Scratch videos that have some different tips and whatnot, and I plan to release at least 20 more, and then I'm going to start working on some longer Scratch projects that show you how to create a project from the beginning. Now, with all these changes I've been making in the podcast, I don't honestly know what you think about them. So I'm curious, what do you like about the changes? What could I continue to improve or refine? I get a ton of feedback on the gaming and drumming content that I create. I get a lot of questions like, how do you do this drumming technique? How do you do that? And I like to demonstrate it and kind of explain it. I can do the same thing with this podcast. If you have questions about pedagogy or research or practice or whatever, as long as it's somewhat related to computer science education, I'm happy to turn this into an episode, because instead of just answering an individual and providing that kind of feedback, I could respond on the podcast and make it so that hundreds, if not thousands of people can also learn from it. If I were to get some questions like that, that'd be wonderful. Most of the feedback that I get is actually when I share a highlight of an episode or a little short on like YouTube or TikTok or whatever, and if it's related, equity related, or if I'm wearing one of my merch shirts that mentions that I'm in the queer or trans communities, then I just get a bunch of hate speech. So a bunch of racist, homophobic, transphobic comments, etc. So it'd be nice to actually get some feedback from educators who actually listen to the content and actually enjoy it, and to learn how I might continue to refine the podcast. Now, my plan for the future is I'm going to continue to release some episodes. I may or may not add in some more interviews. We'll kind of see how that goes in terms of my time, because I'm creating a bunch of gaming and drumming and computer science content outside of the podcast. But the main thing that I'm working on behind the scenes is going through all of the prior episodes and adding in timestamps for the different topics and questions that were discussed in each one of the episodes. I then turn many of those into little highlight reels that I then share on different social media platforms like LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, etc. I've got about 100 more episodes to go through, which might take me multiple months. And my plan between now and then is I'm actually going to think about, do I want to continue the podcast? And if so, in what capacity? So some of the things that I've been thinking about is that the computer science education niche is very small compared to a broader podcast that might be on education in general, or even just a podcast that's outside of education, just talking to people that are doing things and learning things that I think are interesting. And since I'm now trying to make a living off of creating free content, which I know is a bit of an oxymoron, I do need to actually think about the market share in terms of who I can reach and whether or not I can make some money through the AdSense, etc., like on YouTube, so that way I can continue to provide free content for you. At the moment, the gaming and drumming stuff is doing great. Like, I've got this drumming merch that I'm wearing on the YouTube video, which is an inside joke for percussionists. But getting back to the podcast, one of the things I'm thinking about is, do I want to add in another podcast? So like alternate every week. One week will be on computer science education, which is very narrow, very niche. Maybe another podcast just on education, which is broader and can reach more teachers. Or do I just want to focus on doing the other content that I'm creating, like all the gaming and drumming stuff and like the Scratch content? I thoroughly enjoy all the content I create, great, but it takes a lot of time to create content in 3 very distinct areas. So I'm having to make some difficult decisions about what kind of content do I want to continue to create. When it comes to the gaming and drumming stuff, I get a lot of feedback and engagement and whatnot, but when it comes to the computer science stuff, even though the RSS says there's 20,000 people, most of the comments that I get are from people who don't actually listen to the content and just see that there's something equity related in the title and just respond with racist, transphobic, homophobic content, etc. So while one of the goals with this podcast was to try and have an impact on the discourse, the things that we talk about in the field, I don't know if I've reached that goal, to be honest. Because while people will mention to me in person or in an email that, hey, I really enjoyed this episode, etc., it's kind of few and far between. And that's not to complain, it's just to say, hey, it feels like I'm talking and I don't know if people are actually listening. So if you are, let me know what you think. What do you like about this podcast and what could I improve? That's a question that I like to ask myself whenever I finish a stream, whether it's drumming or gaming, and even after I finish a round in Fortnite. When I finish it, what did I do that worked really well and what could I improve to make it so that next time when I play, it's a little bit better. So if you have ideas on topics that I might be able to discuss in the future, or if you have some suggestions on things that I can improve or things that are working really well for you as an individual, just let me know. You can find all my social media accounts at jaredoleary.com up in the socials tab, or you can just simply respond to this video on YouTube or wherever you're listening to this. Now, just to clarify, I'm not sharing this information to complain. I'm just sharing to explain my thought processes. While I enjoy creating this content, I don't know if you do, especially after all the changes that I made over the last several months. But if you enjoy any of the free content that I create on my website, whether it's the computer science education stuff, the drumming stuff, the gaming stuff, whatever, all I ask is that you share. It just helps more people find the content. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. It's pretty cool to get to episode number 200. Again, I'm not sure how long I'll continue the podcast, but I'm enjoying it at the moment. I just don't know if you are. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're staying safe and are having a wonderful week.